Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. What we are witnessing right now is nothing short of historic. We are at the intersection of global politics, economics, and great power rivalry, and the stakes could not be higher. The United States, under Donald Trump's leadership, has tried to assert dominance in Latin America, particularly in Venezuela. But China has made a bold move, what I call its Venezuelan gamble. This gamble is now threatening U.S. influence not only in the Western Hemisphere, but across the entire international order. Let us step back for a moment. For decades, Washington has treated Latin America as its backyard, exerting political, military, and economic control. Venezuela, with the world's largest proven oil reserves, has always been a central target of U.S. policy. When the Trump administration imposed sanctions, sought regime change, and attempted to isolate Caracas, it was meant to be a show of American power. The Trump administration's Venezuela strategy, often described as a maximum pressure campaign, was intended to be a defining show of American power in the Western Hemisphere. Yet, rather than consolidating U.S. influence, this approach has backfired dramatically, exposing deep flaws in Washington's foreign policy playbook and accelerating a shift in regional dynamics that few in the White House anticipated. When Donald Trump came into office, his team believed that Venezuela was ripe for regime change. The country was suffering from economic collapse, political division, and international isolation. U.S. officials assumed that by ratcheting up sanctions, restricting oil exports, and rallying allies in Europe and Latin America, they could topple Nicolas Maduro's government swiftly and restore a pro-Western leadership in Caracas. It was supposed to be quick, decisive, and symbolic of American strength. Instead, it has turned into a case study in strategic miscalculation. The first hook lies in the paradox of power itself. Washington applied every lever it thought it had: sanctions, diplomatic isolation, threats of military force. Yet Maduro's government did not fall. Instead, it survived and even hardened. Sanctions crippled Venezuela's economy, yes, but they also drove Caracas to seek help from elsewhere, and that elsewhere turned out to be Beijing and Moscow. By trying to cut off Venezuela from the global financial system, inadvertently opened the door for China to extend loans, technological cooperation, and energy deals that gave Maduro breathing space. This is the irony that few in Washington are willing to admit. American pressure ended up strengthening the very ties that undermine U.S. influence in the region. Another critical dimension of this failure is the message it sent to the broader world. If maximum pressure could not break Venezuela, a mid-sized country in America's so-called backyard, what credibility does Washington have when it threatens stronger nations? Think of the optics. Trump promised a quick victory, boasting that Maduro's days were numbered. Instead, years later, Maduro remains in power. Venezuela has diversified its international partnerships, and the U.S. looks weaker for having failed. That symbolic defeat resonates globally, especially in capitals that have long resented America's heavy hand. Countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East are now studying Venezuela's survival as a playbook for resisting U.S. coercion. Consider the historical backdrop. For over a century, the Monroe Doctrine framed Latin America as a sphere of U.S. influence where no rival power would be tolerated. Trump's failure in Venezuela represents a direct challenge to that legacy. By failing to dislodge Maduro, the U.S. exposed the limits of its dominance, while China and Russia seized the opportunity to assert themselves in what was once considered Washington's uncontested domain. This is not just a tactical setback, it is a structural shift. The very foundation of U.S. Authority in the Western Hemisphere is being tested and found wanting. The human dimension of this story is equally telling. Trump's sanctions were meant to turn the Venezuelan people against their government, but in practice, they deepened suffering, caused shortages of food and medicine, and devastated livelihoods. For many Venezuelans, the U.S. Came to be seen not as a liberator, but as an aggressor, punishing ordinary citizens in an attempt to achieve political ends. This miscalculation played directly into Maduro's hands, allowing him to frame the crisis as a struggle against foreign imperialism. By underestimating the resilience of Venezuelan society and overestimating the willingness of the population to support U.S. objectives, Trump's strategy only solidified anti-American sentiment in the region. The most striking hook in this narrative is the exposure of American vulnerability. Trump's rhetoric was filled with bravado, threats of military intervention, declarations that all options are on the table. But behind the words, Washington discovered that its options were limited. A military intervention would have been disastrous, alienating Latin America even further. Diplomacy lacked credibility since most countries saw U.S. actions as self-serving, and sanctions, rather than breaking the regime, became an open invitation for China to deepen its influence. In short, Trump revealed the gap between America's perceived power and its actual ability to shape outcomes on the ground. This is why the Venezuela case matters so profoundly. It is not just about one country or one administration. It is a mirror held up to the United States, showing a superpower struggling to achieve its goals, trapped by outdated strategies and blindsided by the rise of new rivals. Trump wanted Venezuela to be the stage on which he showcased American dominance. Instead, it became the stage on which U.S. Decline was laid bare. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why the failure of this strategy continues to reverberate far beyond Caracas. China's role in Venezuela is not an accident of circumstance. It is a carefully calculated gamble, one that has the potential to reshape the balance of power in Latin America and far beyond. At a time when the Trump administration sought to strangle Venezuela's economy and isolate its leadership, Beijing moved in with a different strategy, offering lifelines where Washington offered blockades. This was not charity or goodwill. It was a long long-term investment in influence, resources, and geopolitics. China saw what many in Washington failed to see, that Venezuela, with the world's largest proven oil reserves and a desperate need for external support, was an opportunity too valuable to ignore. And so while Trump tightened the screws, China quietly wove itself into Venezuela's economic fabric. The core of this gamble is oil, the black gold that has defined Venezuela's destiny for decades. China's leaders understood that securing reliable access to energy was critical for their country's long-term development. By offering loans to Caracas, often repaid in barrels of crude rather than dollars, Beijing guaranteed itself steady energy supplies while insulating Venezuela from U.S. financial pressure. This oil for loans strategy has allowed China to bypass the dollar-based system dominated by the United States, creating a parallel network of trade and finance that reduces dependence on Washington. That is the first hook in this story. While America tries to weaponize its financial dominance, China is quietly building an alternative system that others can rely on. Yet oil is only part of the picture. China's involvement in Venezuela goes far deeper than energy. It is about technology, infrastructure, and long-term influence. Chinese firms have built housing projects, telecommunications networks, and even surveillance systems in Venezuela. These are not one-off projects. They are threads in a web of dependence that ties Venezuela more closely to Beijing's orbit. When your mobile networks, your bridges, and even your surveillance technology are built and financed by China, your sovereignty begins to tilt in China's direction. This is what makes Beijing's gamble so powerful. It is not simply transactional, it is transformational. From Beijing's perspective, Venezuela is also a strategic prize. For over a century, the Western Hemisphere has been considered America's exclusive sphere of influence. By establishing a stronghold in Venezuela, China sends a clear message: the age of uncontested U.S. dominance in Latin America is over. This is the second hook, symbolism. China's presence in Caracas is not just about barrels of oil or contracts signed. It is about showing the world that Washington cannot enforce its old Monroe Doctrine. When Chinese banks finance projects in Venezuela or Chinese tankers carry Venezuelan oil eastward, it is a direct challenge to America's claim to supremacy in its own backyard. The gamble carries risks for Beijing. Venezuela's economy remains fragile, corruption is widespread, and political instability looms. Yet this is precisely what makes China's move audacious. Where Western investors see chaos, Beijing sees opportunity. The Chinese leadership is betting that by stepping in when Venezuela has few friends left, it can secure loyalty and influence at a discount. This is a strategy China has applied across the global South: offer loans and infrastructure in exchange for resources and political alignment. But in Venezuela, it takes on a special meaning because of the proximity to U.S. borders. Beijing knows that every investment in Caracas is also a symbolic strike against Washington's credibility. For Trump, This was a nightmare scenario. His administration believed that by isolating Venezuela, the U.S. could demonstrate its power. Instead, China turned isolation into integration, integrating Venezuela into its own sphere of influence. What was meant to be an American victory became an opening for Beijing. The United States, which once prided itself on being the indispensable power, suddenly looked dispensable. That is the third hook, the reversal of roles. America, the self-proclaimed leader of the hemisphere, found itself outmaneuvered by a rival power that approached the problem with patience and pragmatism. The longer this gamble plays out, the deeper China's roots in Venezuela will grow. Each loan, each infrastructure project, each shipment of oil cements a relationship that Washington struggles to undo. Sanctions may block U.S. companies, but they cannot stop Chinese ships from docking in Venezuelan ports. Threats may echo from the White House, but they carry less weight when Beijing is providing the financing Caracas desperately needs. The truth is clear. China has made a bold bet that Venezuela can be transformed from a liability into an asset, from a pariah into a partner. And with every passing year, that bet looks smarter while America's strategy looks more short-sighted. This is the brilliance of Beijing's gamble. It was not made with bluster or bravado. It was made with patience, calculation, and an eye toward the future. And as Venezuela leans ever more heavily on China for survival, Beijing is proving that power in the 21st century is not always seized by force. It is often built through strategy, resources, and the quiet weaving of relationships that last long after sanctions expire and administrations change. For more than a century, the United States has assumed that its dominance in Latin America was unshakable. The Monroe Doctrine, first declared in the 19th century, served as a blunt warning to foreign powers. The Western Hemisphere was off limits. And for decades, Washington enforced this doctrine with coups, interventions, and economic pressure, ensuring that no rival power could gain a foothold in its so-called backyard. But today, in Venezuela, that long-standing assumption is being challenged in ways that were once unthinkable. For the first time in modern history, the United States finds its grip on the region contested not by small regional actors, but by global rivals with the resources, a strategy, and determination to push back. This is the hook that grabs our attention, the unraveling of American hegemony in its own hemisphere. The Trump administration believed that by squeezing Venezuela through sanctions and diplomatic isolation, it would reaffirm U.S. Supremacy in Latin America. But instead of isolating Caracas, this strategy exposed a startling reality. Washington no longer has uncontested authority. China and Russia stepped in, not only supporting Venezuela's leadership, but also signaling to the world that Latin America was open to multipolar engagement. What once would have been met with swift and overwhelming U.S. retaliation has now become normalized. Beijing and Moscow are investing, trading, and even providing military and technological support. while Washington struggles to regain control. That reversal is not just a tactical shift, it is a tectonic one. Consider the symbolism. In the Cold War, when the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba, it triggered a global crisis, nearly plunging the world into nuclear war. Washington would tolerate no rivals in its neighborhood. But today, Chinese oil tankers sail to Venezuelan ports, Russian aircraft land in Caracas, and joint energy deals flourish, all without a decisive U.S. response. The hook here is not only the substance of these moves, but the silence they generate. Uh, what once would have been cause for confrontation now reflects Washington's weakened capacity to enforce its old rules. It is not that America does not notice, it is that America can no longer dictate outcomes as it once did. This shift matters far beyond Venezuela. Other nations in Latin America are watching closely. They see that Venezuela, despite crippling U.S. pressure, has not only survived, but also forged new lifelines through Beijing and Moscow. That survival story is powerful. It tells smaller nations that they too have options, that they are not bound to U.S. dictates. This is the quiet revolution underway Latin America, long viewed as Washington's backyard, is becoming a contested space in a multipolar world. And the more Washington tries to tighten its grip, the more opportunities it creates for others to step in. Trump wanted to project dominance, but his Venezuela policy revealed vulnerability. He sought to demonstrate strength, but instead he revealed weakness. The U.S. now finds itself in an unfamiliar position, competing for influence in a region it once claimed exclusively as its own. That is the final hook, the realization that hegemony, once lost, cannot be easily regained. What we are witnessing is not a temporary policy failure. It is the erosion of a system of control that defined U.S. power for generations, and Venezuela is the stage on which this new contest is playing out for the entire world to see. The story unfolding in Venezuela is not just about one country's struggle or a single failed U.S. Policy. It is a window into a much larger transformation that is shaping the 21st century. We are witnessing the slow but steady emergence of a multipolar world where the United States is no longer the undisputed center of gravity, and where nations across the global south are exploring alternatives that challenge Washington's dominance. Venezuela's pivot toward China is emblematic of this shift. It is not an isolated development, it is part of a broader trend in which countries, tired of sanctions, interference, and conditional aid from the West, are turning toward Beijing as a partner offering a different model of engagement. The hook here is clear. The world is moving away from unipolarity, and Venezuela has become one of the proving grounds for that transition. The failure of Washington's maximum pressure campaign revealed something that leaders from Africa to Asia have long suspected, that American power, while still formidable, is not absolute. When the United States tried to blockade Venezuela financially, China stepped in with loans, technology, and infrastructure projects. When Washington attempted to isolate Caracas diplomatically, Beijing and Moscow offered political cover and strengthened bilateral ties. And when sanctions threatened to choke off the country's access to global markets, Chinese firms provided alternative avenues for trade and investment. This is the crucial hook where America attempted to close doors. China opened them. That pattern has become visible across the developing world, and Venezuela is simply the most dramatic example in the Western Hemisphere. In practical terms, this means that countries now have choices that did not exist a generation ago. For decades, the US and its allies in the IMF and World Bank held near total control over financing, development aid, and trade access. To defy Washington's dictates often meant economic strangulation. But today, China provides an alternative source of credit and investment without the same political conditions. Venezuela's survival under Trump's sanctions regime sent a powerful message even when the United States tries to suffocate a government. Other lifelines exist. Leaders from sub-Saharan Africa to Southeast Asia are watching carefully, noting that there are ways to resist Western pressure without total collapse. This is not just geopolitics, it is a lesson in resilience for nations seeking greater independence. The symbolic importance of Venezuela's pivot cannot be overstated. For over a century, the Western Hemisphere was considered America's uncontested zone of influence. Yet, when Venezuela turned to China and Russia, Washington could not reverse the tide. This demonstrated that multipolarity is not an abstract idea discussed in academic circles. It is already here, manifesting in trade deals, infrastructure projects, and political alliances that cut across old lines of power. The hook is sharp. America's attempts to tighten control in its own neighborhood ended up accelerating the very multipolar order it fears most. For Trump personally, the consequences were damaging. His administration sold itself as a bastion of toughness and strategic clarity, yet Venezuela exposed the limits of both. The spectacle of a mid-sized Latin American country resisting US pressure and openly embracing Chinese support weakened the image of American invincibility. And the more that Washington tried to rally others to its cause, the more obvious it became that the world was no longer aligned along simple US-led lines. In fact, many countries openly refused to follow Trump's lead, wary of being drawn into a failed strategy. That refusal is part of the deeper story. Multipolarity means not only that rivals like China rise, but also that middle powers and smaller nations assert their independence in ways that complicate U.S. plans. Venezuela's defiance, bolstered by Beijing's gamble, is therefore a harbinger of the future. It shows that even in the very heart of America's historical sphere of influence, the unipolar order is breaking down. It is not only about Venezuela's oil or China's loans, it is about the larger recognition that the United States can no longer dictate outcomes unchallenged. The hook that lingers is this: what began as a local power struggle in Caracas has become a symbol of a new global order, where multipolarity is no longer a theory, but a reality. and where U.S. dominance is giving way to competition, choice, and change. The contrast between Washington's approach to Venezuela and Beijing's could not be more striking, and it is in this contrast that the deeper meaning of global politics is revealed. The United States under Trump relied on sanctions, threats, and isolation, tools designed to break down Venezuela's economy and force political change through pressure. China, on the other hand, extended trade, investment, and technology. These two strategies sent very different messages, not only to Caracas, but to the entire world. While Washington's actions were seen as punitive, Beijing's were perceived as constructive. This is the first hook. Symbolism matters in international relations as much as material power. Nations remember who extends a hand and who delivers a blow. When Venezuelans experienced crippling shortages of food, medicine, and basic goods due to U.S. sanctions, the image of America shifted dramatically in their minds. Washington insisted that its measures were aimed only at the government, but on the ground, ordinary people suffered most. In contrast, when Chinese medical supplies arrived or when investments were announced in infrastructure and energy, the image of Beijing became one of partnership rather than punishment. This shift in perception has far-reaching consequences. It is not only about Venezuela, it is about how countries across the global south interpret the actions of great powers. The hook here is that optics shape loyalties, and China has proven adept at appearing as the partner that builds, while the US appears as the power that breaks. The symbolic battle is not just about humanitarian optics, it is also about visions of the future. Washington's approach told nations comply with us or face isolation. Beijing's approach told nations work with us and you will have access to trade, investment, and development. One path evokes fear, the other offers hope. In international politics, hope often outweighs fear in the long run because leaders want to present their people with a vision of progress. Venezuela leaned toward China not only because it needed immediate relief, but because it saw in Beijing a long-term partner willing to engage in building rather than dismantling. This is the second hook in a battle for hearts and minds. Construction beats coercion. The global audience cannot be ignored. Leaders from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East watched closely as Venezuela resisted U.S. sanctions with the help of China. They saw a template for survival, a model of resilience against Western pressure. Every New Deal signed between Caracas and Beijing sent a message to these leaders: you have options. You are not trapped by a single system. That message carries weight far beyond Venezuela's borders. The symbolic victory for China is that it now embodies the idea of choice, while America increasingly symbolizes limitation. For Trump, this was especially damaging. His administration wanted Venezuela to stand as proof of American strength, yet the outcome made Washington look isolated and inflexible. By contrast, China appeared adaptable, pragmatic, and willing to do what the U.S. would not: offer tangible assistance without the same political preconditions. That image resonates in today's multipolar world where governments are tired of being lectured and sanctioned. Uh, they want alternatives, and China has stepped forward to provide them. This is the third hook in a world where image and influence are as valuable as weapons and sanctions. Symbolism becomes power. The long-term consequence of this symbolic shift is profound. While Washington continues to use pressure, it risks alienating the very populations and governments it seeks to influence. Beijing, by presenting itself as a builder and investor, steadily cultivates goodwill that translates into lasting partnerships. In Venezuela, the symbolism of a country surviving with China's help while enduring America's pressure is a story that will echo for years. And as history shows, stories often shape geopolitics just as much as strategies. What was supposed to be a showcase of American strength under Donald Trump has in many ways, revealed the limits of U.S. power. The campaign against Venezuela was designed to demonstrate toughness, decisiveness, and control, a chance for Trump to prove that his administration could bring an adversary to its knees. Instead, the opposite has occurred. Far from toppling Nicolas Maduro, the strategy emboldened him, drove Caracas closer to Beijing and Moscow, and exposed the fragility of Washington's influence. The hook here is sharp. When a superpower sets out to demonstrate dominance but fails, the failure itself becomes more damaging than doing nothing at all. Trump's foreign policy team believed that sanctions and isolation would quickly erode the Venezuelan government. They thought that by cutting off oil revenues and freezing assets abroad, they could push Maduro out and install a leadership more aligned with Washington. This confidence rested on an outdated assumption that U.S. Economic might was enough to dictate outcomes anywhere in the hemisphere. Yet the world had changed. Venezuela did not collapse. Instead, it adapted by turning eastward. China provided loans and markets. Russia offered security and diplomatic cover, and other nations refused to fully align with Washington's plan. The attempt to prove American dominance ended up revealing cracks in it. This failure carried direct consequences for Trump personally. He had built his political image on projecting strength, both domestically and internationally. He spoke in absolutes, promised swift victories, and claimed that adversaries would bend under pressure. But Venezuela became a glaring contradiction to that narrative. All year after year, despite sanctions and threats, Maduro remained in power. To Trump's critics, it was proof that his foreign policy was more rhetoric than results. To his allies, it was an uncomfortable reminder that the United States could not simply will its objectives into being. The hook here is psychological. A leader who thrives on the appearance of strength cannot afford to be seen as ineffective. Yet Venezuela highlighted precisely that weakness. The broader implications are even more significant. America's rivals have studied this episode carefully, drawing lessons about U.S. power. They have seen that even in Washington's traditional spheres of influence, resistance is possible. If Venezuela can withstand pressure, then larger, stronger nations may feel emboldened to chart independent paths. For Beijing and Moscow, Trump's failure became a gift evidence they could point to in persuading other nations that U.S. Threats are not always decisive. The symbolic power of Venezuela's survival reverberates far beyond Latin America. Meanwhile, Trump's domestic audience was left with a mixed picture. His supporters were told repeatedly that he was restoring American greatness and reasserting control abroad. Yet the images from Venezuela, food shortages worsened by sanctions, Chinese ships docking in Venezuelan ports, Maduro defiantly giving speeches, told a different story. For many Americans, it was distant and abstract. But for policymakers and global observers, it was clear U.S. power was being tested and it was faltering. That disconnect between rhetoric and reality is another hook. When words promise dominance, but actions deliver stalemate, credibility erodes both at home and abroad. This is why Trump's strategy in Venezuela represents more than a regional setback. It is a case study in the dangers of overreach. The attempt to impose outcomes through pressure alone underestimated both the resilience of the targeted state and the willingness of rivals to step in. The result is that Trump's power, rather than being solidified, was placed under threat. He wanted a victory to demonstrate control, but instead handed his opponents an example of American limits. And in geopolitics, perception often becomes reality. The perception of weakness can be as damaging as weakness itself. That is the final hook. Trump sought to project invincibility, but Venezuela became a mirror reflecting vulnerability, not just for his administration, but for the very idea of U.S. dominance in the modern era.